New Jersey politics post-Bridgegate, up next on Carpe Diem. Hello and welcome to Carpe Diem. I'm Merrill Brown, Director of the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. Joining me today is Kate Zernike, National Correspondent for the New York Times. Kate has covered New Jersey matters, among other things, including the Bridgegate scandal and trial for over 15 years. Kate has covered topics ranging from Congress to terrorism, the effects of Hurricane Katrina to education. Prior to the New York Times, she was a reporter for the Boston Globe. In 2010, she wrote a book, Boiling Mad, Inside Tea Party America, which gave readers an eye-opening look inside America's Tea Party movement, revealing important philosophical and cultural strains that have long been features of American politics. Kate is here today to talk about New Jersey politics post the Bridgegate scandal, among other things. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks, glad to be here.
So Bridgegate is now wrapped up. The verdict was in early November. It's still resonating through the state and through our political life. Tell us how you look back on the trial, which you attended every day, I gather.
I did. I was there every day. It was fascinating because it's so rare in covering politics that editors are always saying, we need to pull back the curtain and see what's really going on here. And it's hard to do that often. You sort of get, you get what your sources are willing to give you, which is generally with a good dose of spin. So here you had, and the Christie administration was quite secretive all along, or quite, well managed. But here in this trial, you had 6 weeks of testimony that really pulled back the curtain and showed you how the administration was run, really from not just around the Bridgegate scandal, but as soon as the governor came into office in 2010, and how they began preparing for his re-election effort in 2013 and preparing for him to run for president in 2016. So it was kind of amazing just to see, the way the governor's office was structured and the machinations that were going on. And
what did it tell you about life in New Jersey and politics in New Jersey?
It reinforced a lot of stereotypes about life in New Jersey and politics in New Jersey. It was definitely, it revealed an administration that was very, incredibly political. I mean, everything was done with a political nature. So, one of the most striking things, and this really resonated, I think, with people across the country, was, in New Jersey, New Jersey obviously feels very emotional about the attacks of September 11th. And there was a plan in the Christie world, as it was called, to take the flags. They were distributing flags and steel from the World Trade Center site to mayors all around New Jersey, particularly Democratic mayors, because you had a Republican governor whose strategy, and it was a creative strategy, was to win re-election and then establish himself as the most viable Republican candidate nationally by saying, look, I have all this broad support. I have women, I have Hispanics, I have Democrats, I have all these groups that Republicans don't win. And he kept saying if Republicans want to win nationally, they need to build a broad coalition. So he was doing that in New Jersey, and they were using this 9/11 sort of emotional materials like the steel and the flags to distribute to Democratic mayors to try to win their endorsements. And they had this plan to take flags, as David Wildstein said, the sort of superstar witness, the turncoat, if you're in the Christie administration, testified that they were going to take these flags and have a flag from the World Trade Center flying over every VFW in Iowa, South Carolina, and New Hampshire. So in other words, they were going to take the strategy that they had in New Jersey and take it nationally. So again, it was just everything was done with an eye to Governor Christie's political future. The other thing, again, reinforcing the New Jersey stereotype was just the way they spoke about each other. Everything was family, and everything was, when someone misbehaved, it was, you want me to pop him off, you want me to, blow his head off with a shotgun kind of thing. So it was metaphorically, yes. I don't think anybody actually intended to do that, but it was metaphoric. There was another one. There was talk of someone taking a dirt nap, which is again sort of a stereotype. We would think of that as sort of a Sopranos episode.
I want to stick with this point and read to you something you wrote a couple weeks ago after the trial.
Yeah.
You said the trial, quote, pulled back the curtain on the grubby politics of Christie world and the essential Jerseyness of New Jersey.
Yes.
I thought that was a wonderful quote, but what did you mean by that?
Well, I guess some of the stuff that I was just talking about, but really everything was sort of, again, relentlessly political. So it was interesting, one of the young staff members who worked for Christie and then went on to work for him in New Hampshire when he was running for president, talked about how one of the things they had done for Fort Lee, which was the town that so the Bridgegate Center, just to recap,
Yes.
was in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and they shut down these lanes from Fort Lee to the tolls on the bridge to create a huge traffic jam in Fort Lee. They wanted to punish the mayor of Fort Lee for not endorsing the governor, and they had this long courtship with the mayor of Fort Lee, using what they called the Port Authority goodie bag. So that was again sort of
those are their words.
Those are their words. That was the grubby political stuff, right? So the Port Authority, which is supposed to run transportation projects, airports, roads, bridges, that was seen as a goodie bag. That was seen as, in their words, sort of treats for people we want to take care of. And they had a whole elaborate system in something called the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, where they tracked what they had given to various mayors so they could remember what mayors owed them in return. So one of the things that this young staff member talked about doing in Fort Lee, and the mayor of Fort Lee talked about, was they got an episode of Morning Joe, and they filmed it at Fort Lee High School. And this young staff member referred to this as, I can't remember if he said it was good constituent relations or good government. And so, you have to wonder, like, why having the governor appear on Morning Joe in Fort Lee is doing anything for the citizens of Fort Lee. It's doing a lot for the governor, certainly, and maybe it's doing something for Morning Joe, but it's not doing much for the citizens of Fort Lee.
So sticking with that, again, that same theme, when the trial began, and we all recall, the first day of it even was shocking, because Christie was identified as participating at a level in the Bridgegate situation he had not previously acknowledged. So he was looming over the trial, even though it never came to pass that he was charged and unlikely to be charged now.
Right.
How do you look back on that moment when Christie was named and the trial and what it means for Christie?
It was head spinning, honestly, because we had all the reporters covering this had anticipated. Remember, this happened almost 3 years ago. So we've had a lot of time to sort of get the narrative and figure out what was going to come out in court.
Or get someone's narrative.
Someone's narrative, right. And you've heard various sides. So you had a sense of what people were going to say in court. But I don't think anybody expected that what was so, frankly, mind-blowing about that moment was it was the prosecution saying this, right? So
the government.
The government. So we knew that the defense was going to say Governor Christie knew about this, because that was a way to take the blame from their clients, right? From them, from Bridget Ann Kelly and Bill Baroni. But we didn't expect the prosecution to say Christie knew. So that was why that moment was so stunning. The governor continued to insist that he knew nothing about this, that he said no believable testimony, because the testimony that established that Christie knew about this, what David Wildstein said, the mastermind of this whole thing, said was that Governor Christie knew about this on the third day of a 5-day lane closing. So in other words, Governor Christie knew about this at a moment when he could have reversed those lane closings. He knew about it, he knew it was punitive, he knew they were ignoring the mayor's calls for help. So Governor Christie took advantage of the fact that David Wildstein is a bit of a dicey witness. He's someone who is cooperating with the government in the hopes of avoiding prison time. And so Governor Christie said, no believable testimony established that I knew about this. To which the U.S. attorney said, well, we don't put people on the stand unless we believe what they're saying. So in other words, the government does believe that Governor Christie knew about this. What they don't have is sort of hard documentary evidence. It's interesting, years ago after now 3 years ago after the scandal broke, people said to me, Governor Christie had said to them, I learned as United States Attorney not to put anything in email. It's all tweets, it's all text, because you can get rid of text, and texts are harder to trace. So he was very skilled at avoiding any documentary paper trail on this.
So as the fall moved toward Election Day, Christie had seemed to have avoided the worst case scenarios for him, and his national political star was again ascendant. He was named head of the president-elect's transition team. And then suddenly, as of a couple of weeks ago, he no longer was.
Right.
So how do you read all that in the context of Bridgegate and Christie's future?
Well, it's interesting because Christie, people always say, I've written a number of these stories myself. Christie's had a terrible week. He's definitely out. This was when he wasn't chosen for vice president back in the summer. And Christie has always found a way to bounce back. This time seems, and I will say seems, because you never know, but seems very different, because this was kind of, I think he didn't expect Trump to win, as a lot of people didn't win. Apparently he was, I think the falling out with President-elect Trump began with the Access Hollywood tape, where Trump was revealed to have said these sort of horrible things about women on tape. And Governor Christie came out and said, this is, it's indefensible, and I think Trump didn't like that. So Christie was not invited to election night, from everything I'm told, but showed up anyway at Trump Tower, showed up to celebrate the election victory, and sort of saw this as like a victory partly for himself. Here was going to be his chance again to resurrect his political career. And I think he thought he was going to get a very high-profile position. In the end, he really alienated people in, call it Trump world, primarily Jared Kushner, who's Trump's son-in-law and whose father was prosecuted by Christie as United States Attorney. But I think also Rudy Giuliani was a figure who was increasingly opposed to Christie playing a significant role. So he was downgraded from the transition team, and I think right now had been telling people he didn't expect any future role.
And what of his future?
So I keep saying to people, I think you'll expect to hear a lot of him on WFAN, which is the Boomer and Carton show, sports radio in New York. That's where he actually made his first comments about this Access Hollywood tape that Trump did, or Trump appeared on. So he's been doing a lot of that. He's obviously he's term limited on running again. I think probably in this latest, in the Trump transition, I think he was probably expecting that he would get a big national role, might rebuild his political career. He's young enough he could run for president again. That seems, again, that word seems increasingly unlikely now. So I think he has been telling people more recently he fully intends to finish out his term in New Jersey. He's got a year left in his term as governor, and he said he's going to go out the way he came in, which was loud.
And what might that mean from a policy point of view? Gasoline tax is implemented. There are challenges in Atlantic City, obviously.
Yeah.
What next in that regard?
It's interesting on the gas tax because I think he's selling that as I did the right thing. This is something that a second-term governor does. This is the bold move. I think it was actually just a necessary move. They had maxed out every way they could to fill the Transportation Trust Fund, which is the fund that fixes our bridges and roads. So I think he had to fill to find a way to fund the Transportation Trust Fund. The gas tax was a way to do that. I think he's going to, one last way he might make his name nationally is on the issue of school funding. Many states, it sounds sort of wonky, but many states do have a court decision similar to the one in New Jersey where we have to give a certain amount. The court has said we have to lift up state spending on particularly poor school districts. This has often been a point that wealthier school districts contest. Again, we saw there's a big decision on this in Connecticut last summer, so this is something that resonates across the country. Christie has said, I want to give everyone the same amount. Enough of this giving money to cities that continue to have failing schools. So we might see him doing more with charter schools, with education funding. I think that's one area. I don't know where else. I guess Atlantic City will certainly be a widely watched effort.
So his soon to occur disappearance from New Jersey civic life is a little bit parallel to yours, because you've covered New Jersey for a long time and you're moving on to other things at the New York Times. How do you look back on what it's like to cover New Jersey for the New York Times?
It was a lot of fun, I have to say. I covered New Jersey starting in 2012, and I left in October of 2015 to cover education, which is something that I'd covered at the Times before that, and covered even at the Boston Globe prior. It was one of the first things I did in my career. I went back to cover education, did it nationally, did a bunch of stories, but it's sort of, New Jersey is an incredibly interesting political story. It's sort of hard to not hear the gossip. It's hard to not be fascinated by it. And because I live here, it's hard not to run into people who know what's going on and to sort of be interested in their story. So when the opportunity to cover the trial came up, that was something that definitely interested me. And as you said earlier, this trial just pulled back this curtain and sort of told us a lot, not only about Governor Christie, but about New Jersey.
And so, but as you assess New Jersey today, it certainly is an interesting and diverse place, but it has a shaky economy and lots of questions about its future. What do you think about where New Jersey is?
Well, certainly, so we've now had a 10th credit downgrade, which the governor will also have to contend with. I think its fiscal challenges are enormous. Obviously, the biggest one is going to be the pension. We now have the worst funded pension of anyone in the country. We've surpassed Illinois in that regard, which is no great honor. So that's an issue. I think New Jersey, because of its proximity to New York on one end and Philly on the other, is kind of an interesting media market too, because we tend to get split. It's the barrel tapped on either end. So I think that's a question, but I think primarily it's going to be a fiscal question. We now have what we would appear to be swinging back blue in the governor's office. We have Phil Murphy, a Democrat, who's sort of seems to have wrapped up the nomination, but that race is again a year away, and I'll be fascinated to see. We do have other people running for governor. We have Jim Johnson, John Wisniewski have both declared. So it'll be interesting to see if they can create enough momentum to, take away from this Murphy juggernaut. It'll be interesting to see whether the lieutenant governor decides to run, whether other Republicans get any traction. and how they contend with the Christie legacy.
So last New Jersey question before we move on to national topics. New Jersey, it is said, to your point about media coverage, is often neglected. You had a relatively lonely life covering it for the large New York Times across the river. What of the New York Times and its relationship to New Jersey?
Well, I will say that, the New York Times, like other large media operations, legacy media operations, is sort of recalibrating thinking about what we want to cover, how we cover the country, how we cover the region, and we are increasingly an international news organization. But all that said, of all the regional bureaus that we have covered and had over the years, we've had Long Island, we've had Connecticut, we've had New Jersey. New Jersey is the one they are still interested in covering, and I think there is a sense that New Jersey stories resonate across the country, and that's not just with the New York Times. If you look at TV and the programs, you've seen The Sopranos have a huge effect, the Jersey Shore, and those may be the stereotypes of New Jersey, but people kind of eat it up. There is sort of a, it's a big, bold state despite its relatively small size, and so I think people are genuinely interested in that. So the Times is committed to covering it. What that means, I think before I came, there was nobody. And that was nobody bouncing back from a time when we had about 10 reporters here. We had people in Trenton, we had people in Newark, we had people wandering the more suburban communities. So there was a time when we covered it very aggressively. I think I covered it aggressively, but you need people to do that.
Right. So we'll see.
We'll see, but I think there is at least nominally a commitment to keep covering it.
So in the context of the election of President-elect Trump, you wrote a book a few years ago about the Tea Party. There are some people who liken his ascension to the Tea Party movement, and he's just named a Tea Party partisan to run the CIA.
Right.
How do you think that political evolution has taken place? How do you assess it against the backdrop of the Tea Party?
I think it's interesting. So my book was in 2010, which was a midterm election year. And I had long said that the Tea Party was successful that year because it was a midterm election year, because turnout in midterms are lower, right? So they had tremendous influence on Congress that year. I would not have expected, because I was not out in the country reporting this year, I would not have expected them to have that much significance in a presidential election year. But I think, again, it was a presidential election year where we had low turnout, so organization really mattered. So I think the ground game was something the Tea Party really learned to master starting in 2009. And so I think we've seen the effect of that. I also think, I said a long time after my book came out, for a number of years afterward, the Tea Party didn't go away. It sort of began to, there was kind of a Tea Party inflection to our politics. So even for Democrats, it was much harder to talk about increasing spending. It was, the environment became less of a concern. There was much more of a nod to we have to take into consideration the Tea Party view of things. There are certain things we can't talk about, and so I think that has now come to dominate our politics. I also think it's a cultural change, right? So what we saw in this election was this feeling of disaffection. So people who feel like the coasts are out of touch, the blue coasts are out of touch with what they think, the way they live their lives, and they felt that Hillary Clinton and before her President Obama were out of touch with their lives. They went for Donald Trump because they recognized in him, they felt that he was the outsider the way they see themselves as outsiders. And that, again, is something that's a great reflection of the Tea Party movement, because that was what powered that movement.
So the election of President-elect Trump in that context might not have been as big a surprise to you as it was to other people?
No, I don't think. I think if you had been out and I know this from talking to my colleagues on the national desk, I think if you had been out in the country talking to people, it was pretty clear that there was a great disaffection, that there was not, President Obama, who's sort of seen as very, this sort of cool transformational character on the coasts, is not seen that way in the middle of the country.
How is he seen?
Well, I think it's, I think there's a lot of resentment about Obamacare, the sense that healthcare premiums are going up, and wasn't Obamacare supposed to solve this? And I'm not saying Obamacare is the problem. I think, again, he faced a lot of Republican opposition. They weren't allowed to do many of the things that would have brought costs down. That's a much larger conversation. But I think it's seen as sort of, it's almost this, I would say urban cool. It's sort of people feel that this doesn't relate to their lives, that this is sort of this is a major media market phenomenon, and they are in these much smaller media markets. They don't feel that people understand the way they live. And there's this resentment, the sense that Washington, New York, this sort of a Acela corridor is out of touch with their concerns. Really, that's the disaffection we see.
Well, you wrote this book 6 years ago now, and you identified a series of phenomena going on in the country, and yet one might argue it was, or at least those themes, underreported and practically ignored in the current election cycle. How did that happen? You knew about it.
I did. I wasn't out reporting this cycle, so I didn't see it this cycle. I wouldn't have predicted it. I anticipated President-elect Clinton along with many people. I think you really do need to get out into the country. I think, I think probably it's a function of political reporters being based in Washington or New York, and national correspondents maybe not sort of that coverage. Our political coverage did not include enough sort of going out into the country. I think there is, and this again is something that I think causes a lot of disaffection with people reading the coverage, right? Which actual voters is we don't do enough going out and talking to voters. I think we do a lot of sort of. I think our political coverage, not the Times, but I think in general in this country, has been very kind of consultant driven. We tend to focus on the drama because it is really interesting, and the gossip and who's up and who's down and who's saying what in Washington and New York. I do think that creates a sense of, or it takes us away from what actual voters are saying. And there is sort of the sense that voter stories, as a reporter, none of us like to go out and do the Voices story. It seems sort of unimportant. But those are voters. Those are people. Those are the people who are actually deciding this election.
And they did decide this election.
Absolutely.
In a certain fashion. So one of the other pieces of your historic expertise is about education. Mm-hmm. There will be, no doubt, a Trump education series of issues. I mean, Trump supporters have suggested, the Department of Education be abolished. Exactly mm-hmm. what his position is on some of these issues is unclear. What is the policy agenda in education that the new administration faces?
So there has been a big push for among Democrats and Republicans, or a certain strain of Democrats, right? We've seen a group, for instance, called Democrats for Education Reform, which is kind of code word for Democrats for more charter schools, who feel that the teachers' unions have been too intransigent. Democrats for Education Reform, or reformers, would tend to be people who want to see more testing. They supported Common Core, which was an attempt to establish a national set of standards of what kids should know. So I think that group, Democrats for Education Reform, has encouraged people they support not to work with the Trump administration because they think it's going to be bad for poor kids. I think that's financially. But the reality is they do support some of the same things, which would be, again, charter schools. There's sort of a split around the issue of higher standards. Common Core was one of these things that created great disaffection out in the states. So Common Core was an attempt by the National Governors Association, other big national groups, but not the federal government, to get a set of standards of what kids should know. On the far right, you saw people who believed this was an attempt to impose, to sort of indoctrinate children. So there was huge blowback. Trump himself said he didn't support Common Core. So that's going to be an issue they deal with, the issue of testing. But there is also now, during the Obama administration, there was a rewriting of the federal education law that sent a lot of the power back to the states. So I think we'll continue to see that. We'll continue to see the states in charge of that. So what that means is it's going to be up to the states to say these are the standards for what our kids need to know. It's going to be up to the states to say this is what our schools need to spend on education. I think the danger here is always one of resources, right? So that if we have more charter schools, the inevitable consequence is that there is less money for traditional public schools. So I think as we see, I think that's going to be a real issue on funding. And that tends to mean, charters tend to be based in urban areas, but, again, going back to what Christie wants to do with education, I think it tends to mean that money, there's going to be this attempt to pull back some of the extra money that we've been spending in urban areas. So that's going to be the real concern.
Trump rails about Common Core,
mm-hmm.
although some Republicans even are divided about it.
Right.
Do you think it's a priority for the new administration?
Well, it's interesting because really it is a state question. I mean, it's a little bit like, I was going to say it's a little bit like abortion, that this really, it matters what states are doing, right? That's where the power is. And in the states, even where this has been a huge, where there's been a huge uprising against Common Core, what the states have generally done is said, we're going to re-examine Common Core. And so they create a commission that re-examines Common Core, and they end up calling it the Indiana Common Core, or the Indiana standards, or the New Jersey standards, and it really looks sort of a lot like what the Common Core was. So in some ways, it's more bluster than anything else. But I don't see, this talk of getting rid of the Department of Education that's been going on since Reagan, and perhaps even before then, it's never happened.
And do you fully expect to come back to Trump and his fascinating chemistry with Christie, that we really have seen the last of Christie in national politics? National Trump politics, I should say.
The way Christie is talking now, it would seem that way. he really is one of these people you can't count out, and that is why he's been so fascinating to cover, because he always manages to come up in some other direction.
And when you say cover, do you know him well?
No.
Have you ever had lunch with him? Does he make himself accessible to reporters?
Oh no, he hates the New York Times. Don't you remember? You perhaps don't remember that he had this great thing about a couple years ago. He was asked what he was giving up for Lent, and he said the New York Times. And then he said, but of course you're supposed to give up something you actually like. So he couldn't give up the New York Times. He'd already given us up. So no, I mean I've been in meetings with other reporters with him, but there was never a lot of love there. So the way you have to cover Christie for the New York Times is to sort of go in from the outside and cover the people around him and people who are close to him,
who were accessible.
Who were accessible, but like other sources had to be, you had to spend some time talking to them. It's what reporters do.
Right, of course. Well, thanks for joining us today, Kate. It's a great conversation, and congratulations on your New Jersey work.
Thank you.
If you'd like more information about this episode of Carpe Diem or any other Carpe Diem, you can write to us at the email address on your screen. That's carpediem@mail.montclair.edu, or call us at 973-655-5158. For Carpe Diem, I'm Merrill Brown. Thanks for watching.